the news is that the administration is going to provide cluster munitions to the Ukrainians. These are weapons that 100 nations ban, including some of our closest NATO allies. When there was news that the Russians might be using it, admittedly against civilians, your then press secretary said this might be to constitute war crimes. What made you change your mind and decide to give them these weapons?
Two things, Fareed, and it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill. And we're in a situation where Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by munitions, by these cluster munitions that have dud rates that are very, very low, very high, that are dangerous to civilians, number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition that they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, took the recommendation of the Defense Department to not permanently, but to allow for in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, to provide them with something that has a very low dud rate. It's about I think it's 150, which is the least likely to be blowing. And it's not used in civilian areas. They're trying to get through those trenches and then stop those tanks from rolling. And so, but it was not an easy decision, and we're not signatories to that agreement, but it took me a while to be convinced to do it. But the main thing is they either have the weapons to stop the Russians now keep them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive through these areas.
What's up, everybody? This is Lions Den with your news and commentary. So let me get this straight. The United States government is sending the Ukrainian government cluster munitions, which is like cluster bombs, that can annihilate half of some countries around the world, which 500 countries are banning these weapons. This is quite concerning. And I'm going to tell you why it's quite concerning. When you send cluster munitions, which are called cluster bombs, into a country, half of the country will be annihilated. It's just like sending a nuclear bomb into a country. And when you launch that nuclear bomb, the entire city, the entire state will be eradicated. So with these cluster munitions that, your President Joe Biden has decided to send Ukrainians, it's very concerning, because the Russians know that we're involved with the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, that we're allies with the Ukrainians. And by sending them these weapons, it's going to cause even more trouble, because Vladimir Putin is going to say, the United States is now the enemy because you're sending these weapons against them, against their citizens, right? And now, according to this interview from CNN, he defended on why he decided to send those weapons. It's not easy, but you knew by doing that, it's going to be suffering massive consequences. So now Russia's going to look back at this and say the U.S. is interfering in something that got nothing to do with them. But then our allies and us who's supporting and backing Ukraine are going to say, well, Ukraine don't have enough weapons. Ukraine is losing ammo, so we have to do. The reality is that Russia don't not want us to send weapons to Ukraine in the first place, but sending cluster munition to Ukraine, which are cluster bombs, which means half of, let's just say basically Georgia. Now, Georgia is part of the Russian territory. Picture Georgia. let's just say, and it's not going to happen, but let's just say that Ukraine decided using cluster munitions on parts of Georgia. Half of that town will be eradicated with a cluster bomb alone. It'll be eradicated. A small town in the country of Georgia will be gone by using those cluster bombs. And now we're sending it to Ukraine, and now the Russians is going to look at this and say, the United States meddling with our affairs again. And I'm telling you right now, it's going to end up being World War III. And the people talk about, oh, that's not going to happen. Listen, when President Biden sent those cluster munitions, which is cluster bombs, to the Ukrainians, it spells trouble with the Russians. The Russians are going to look at this and say, this is the act of war against the United States. And I'm going to tell you this right now. And we always focus on other local affairs like the Kiki Palmers, like other Monster and Western Women and all the other stuff. But then there's big issues like this case when we send the Ukrainians cluster munitions, cluster bombs that can eradicate a small town. Like, for example, let's say it's a small town in Montana, and we use these cluster bombs on that small town. There would not be no small town left. That's how powerful these cluster bombs are. And 500 countries already banned these same weapons. But yet, we sending Ukraine these weapons against Russia? This is unbelievable. And the way it looks right now, if they continue to do this, the United States and Russia probably are at war. And that's one thing we do not want to get involved with Russia right now. By sending these controversial cluster munitions to Ukraine and use it against Russia, this is an act of war. And that's one thing they don't really realize. And American citizens need to be vigilant with this. Need to watch this carefully, because now, by sending cluster bombs to the Ukrainians, and even though the Ukrainian president said Zelensky gonna say we're not gonna use it against Russia, I'm gonna tell you like this: if the Russia continues doing what they do in the Ukraine, they don't have a choice but to use those same cluster bombs we sent to them, to their country, and these small towns of Russia may not be no more. And these Russians gonna use that against the United States as an act of war. Y'all let me know what you think about this in the comments, and I'll talk to you in my next video. This Langston signing off. Deuces.